Buenos días, mi nombre es Manuel Urillac y es un placer darles la bienvenida esta mañana. I am a partner at Shearman Sterling and I practice in our Latin American group, and I'm more generally a member of our capital markets and M&A groups. I would like to welcome you all to the 5th session of our LATAM Compliance and Investigations webinar series, a timely discussion on the various challenges of conducting a compliance program remotely from both the US and the Latin American perspectives. Over the last couple of weeks, each of the webinars centered around a different jurisdiction, including Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, to name just a few. For today's discussion, we have teamed up with Payet Rey Caubi Perez Abogados for a Peru-focused discussion in which the panelists will analyze some of the most pressing compliance issues companies are facing during these uncertain times. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. If you did not receive links to the presentation materials and the CLE forms in an email this morning, please go to the Zoom chat for links and you can download the materials. The CLE code will be read at the end of the session. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box located at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device, to submit them to the speakers. Now I will present my distinguished panelists. Our moderator for the program is Philip Urofsky. He is a partner in our litigation practice and a former DOJ prosecutor. He has extensive experience investigating, prosecuting, and defending criminal and civil violations of the FCPA, money laundering, mail and wire fraud statutes, and economic sanctions laws and other regulations. Katherine Stoller is a counsel in our litigation practice. She has wide-ranging experience involving white-collar criminal defense, internal investigations, regulatory enforcement matters, and securities and other complex litigation. She focuses on investigations involving allegations of securities fraud, money laundering, economic sanction violations, price fixing, accounting fraud, insider trading, and the False Claims Act. And our guest speaker is our colleague, Carlos Patrón, a partner with Payet Rey Caubi Perez. He is a partner specializing in antitrust, corporate, and regulatory law. He has extensive experience advising on issues related to Peruvian competition law and has participated in some of the most emblematic price-fixing investigations carried out in Peru. He also has significant experience in the design and implementation of compliance programs and conducting audits and forensic investigations. Prior to joining the firm, he held various high-level positions at the National Institute for the Defense of Competition and the Protection of Intellectual Property, Peru's National Consumer Protection Authority. And without further ado, Philip, I turn the panel over to you.
Thank you, Manuel. So, just give you I want to give everyone an overview of what we're going to talk about today. You know, this is obviously unprecedented, at least in my lifetime, times in terms of how law firms and companies, our clients, are doing business and the challenges we're facing in maintaining even some degree of normalcy or lack thereof. So what we want to talk to you about today is, how do you approach compliance when everything is being done differently and your organization is under extreme stress in some cases? And then we're going to move on to more of the investigation side, like if you have whistleblowers and you're not in your office or they're not in their office, how do you respond? What do you do that might be different from what you were doing before? How do you do investigations? How do you, and also how do you respond or deal with government agencies who also may not be working from their offices or have complete access to their normal resources? And finally, is there a COVID-19 defense? And I'll sort of step on the lead on that one and simply say there's not. There is no defense. But there may be, arguments you can make to various government agencies to seek either leniency or accommodation as you go forward. So let's talk a little bit about our current situation. What has changed and how are companies responding? Well, for many companies, this is an existential time period. I mean, the question of being able to survive a situation where your stores aren't open or your sales channels are severely restricted, or your vendors, your supply chain is severely restricted, puts companies and law firms themselves under some extreme stress. And it also, there's new risks, new changes to how companies are doing business. For instance, in the United States, the government is plowing large amounts of stimulus money into the economy, and in a direct way. So direct loans or grants to businesses to keep people employed, direct grants of money to large industries to try to keep them open, to mitigate some of the consequences of the economic crisis that attends upon the pandemic. And that means companies that may never have dealt with the government besides paying taxes or maybe having a health inspection now are dealing with government in a very different way and with a lot of apparent controls on them. And I can tell you that at least in the United States, the assumption is there will be fraud, waste, and abuse in connection with these government programs. And we're already seeing some of that as already. So much a significant change in risk that the companies are doing, and the compliance program that they had that might have been focused and let's hope properly designed to address the risks they had before the start of this year now may no longer be either workable, they may not have sufficient resources, or they just may not address these new risks that I just mentioned. So companies have to just think about, how do we make sure that we are addressing the risks that we're facing in our circumstances? I can, and one thing the companies are doing obviously is cutting costs. I mean, they're cutting costs because they're not making as much money, and they and ultimately that is the goal of a company. But there is a risk that comes with that too. And a DOJ official recently said, if a company has brought its compliance department down to a skeleton crew, that's obviously not something we're going to love. We need to understand why the company would have done that and what steps they're taking to ensure the company is still meeting its legal and compliance obligations. And we've seen similar statements from, for instance, from the FSA in the UK and from some of the Brazilian authorities, and I'm sure in Peru, you've probably heard similar things as well. So what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes is how companies should address these new risks, how they should address having new vendors, new customers, new markets, and so on. And I think with that introduction, Carlos, what should companies be doing right now?
Hey, good morning to all. Just to touch on a couple of things that you just mentioned. It's true, we have to be very careful right now. Compliance is not just bribery and money laundering as has been traditionally in the past in Peru. We have a series of new risks involved that we have to be very careful with. Reopening authorization, sanitary protocols that have to be registered with health authorities, surveillance and prevention of COVID in the workplace, new workplace requirements that are very strict, probably the harshest, the most formal requirements in Latin America to reopen establishments have been passed by the Peruvian government. This is all new ground for us. The use of the government reactivation fund, as you mentioned, similar to the US, this is new, and the money can only be used for certain activities, not for any type of expenditure. This is something companies are really not prepared for and have to be aware of. The emergency powers that the government has now have allowed it to bypass regular procurement procedures, and now they're doing direct purchasing, which is a huge exposure, a huge risk. We're seeing a lot of investigations on government procurement right now. Export restrictions and approvals. We're a very open economy. We've never had approvals to export goods. We're having that now. We have to go through government officials to allow us to do business as usual. Again, new risks that we haven't been exposed to before, and this is something I guess we'll touch on as we go by. The obvious, I guess, the slide I have in front of me says the easy stuff. It's really not that easy. This is the time to reaffirm your commitment to compliance and to encourage reporting, to reaffirm a culture of compliance and your company values. As Philip mentioned, there are financial pressures, there's work security issues, there are sales goals that have to be met. The stars are aligned for significant compliance breaches right now. I know companies have the incentive to cut costs in nonprofit centers like compliance, but that can be a mistake. I mean, since there is significant pressure to step out of bounds right now, cutting costs in key compliance sectors could create dangerous gaps in control. In any event, what we've been talking with clients is you have to consider focusing your resources, which are scarce now, in the most significant risk that you're facing. You have to keep your communication channels open. Communication is key here. You have to promote the use of information. Only with information will you be able to monitor risks in this new limited environment. We've actually seen a spike of compliance work during the quarantine. I really wasn't expecting it, but there's been a lot of work related to risk assessment. There's a lot of training going on, which I think is great. Video training is not it has its pros and its cons. I mean, you don't have that interaction that you have with people when you train them, but it allows you have a lot of people right now who have the time and have the resources to train. And we should, again, reemphasize corporate values through training, virtual training means, encourage communication, identify those employees who are facing new challenges and new tasks, and give them the support they need, the training they need to face these new circumstances. Again, online tools like this webinar again show us that communication and training can be done through remote means, and we shouldn't let our guards down. I think that's the basics.
I think you're on mute, Philip.
I'm muted. I know. I realized. All right. So there we go. So as you say, webinars, wonderful things, right? So if that was the easy stuff, let's talk about some of the harder stuff then. What do you do in terms of with new business and new transactions? What is the role of compliance when the company is going all out to find new customers and new supply chain and new vendors and so on?
I actually had a nice conversation last night with a friend and client who's a compliance officer at a multinational company. And well, basically it was a unilateral conversation. I just got all the complaints. Social distancing and home office are affecting interactions of compliance officers and the people they supervise and authorize. And then at the same time, the companies are facing a very rapid changing environment that requires rapid decision making. What she was mentioning is that she felt that everybody was in a frenzy. This was like DEFCON 5. And everybody was trying to get things done and approvals and proper procedures were not, or she felt were not being necessarily properly followed. And yes, these extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures from from the officers of the company to be able to adapt to this environment. But what we're discussing is compliance needs to be flexible as well. You have to be able to grant approvals and go through your procedures and get a quick turnaround in a world where you're not going to have perfect information as in the past. You have to be flexible. You need to be able to adapt as your business adapts. And you should probably have your priorities straight. I mean, everything is hectic. You've got limited resources. You have to prioritize. So you have to focus and have particular emphasis on these areas that we can identify as higher risk in this context than in normal times. Again, public procurement, particularly in Peru, we have a tradition, a reputation of problems in public procurement. Government agencies are out of control. In the sense that they're not going through formal procedures because they're using emergency powers. We know that's a higher risk area. We should focus on enhanced due diligence in these type of things. The use of public funding, the Reactiva Fund, again, another high risk area we should focus on. Emergency vendors or outsourcing, now that supply chains have broken, again, they have to go through some sort of expedited know your vendor process. Maybe not your traditional process, but you cannot let it be. I mean, you need to have flexible and quick processes to engage with these new actors that you require. There are certain key areas, I guess, within any compliance program. Finance is key, and you have to insist and check that your expenditures are properly documented. The payment terms are clearly agreed upon, and that nothing strange going on in that sector. Again, new vendors, consultants, outsourcing. You need to go through your know your provider, know your client procedures. Top management, this is the key gatekeeper. In this frenzy, a lot of contacts among competitors and guilds to coordinate, to understand, and the risk of improper coordination and antitrust risks is very severe in this context. There is no such thing, and we'll go and discuss this later, as a COVID exemption in general in antitrust or anti-bribery regulations. So again, you have to be flexible and prioritize there where the higher risks are perceived.
Okay, so let's assume that our company here has done its risk assessment, adjusted its controls, done training, is keeping an eye on red flags and expediting but not shortcutting review. Katherine, what should it be doing in terms of auditing and monitoring its compliance program?
Sure. So in terms of auditing and compliance, I think, as Carlos said, one of the main messages that we have for clients, and that I think our clients understand, is that by this point, the show must go on. We saw a period of extreme stress followed by a period of reaction. I think in the first few weeks of the lockdown, it seemed incomprehensible that audits could continue in that environment. People were starting to move to a desktop audit model, but a lot was just being pushed back with the expectation that perhaps we could continue business as usual within a few weeks. And now that it's clear that the constraints on business have lasted significantly longer and that to some degree will last going forward, we're seeing people move toward using the resources that we do have to come back onto schedule. And we're seeing a lot of really important steps to use the technology we have and the resources we have to get audit programs continuing. Some things are easier for some companies than others. There's a lot of files that are accessible remotely. There's a lot that aren't. We're seeing people take advantage of doing interviews and webinars and things where people are speaking to each other remotely. We're also seeing people using screen sharing. So for example, if you can't get to a program in a local branch of a financial institution where someone may use a transaction monitoring program, can you screen share? Can you do that remotely in a way that it wouldn't have been expected to before? And so we are seeing a lot of creativity and a need for increasing creativity in order to keep audit and compliance rolling. Because it is important. The government still expects it, management still expects it. Another thing that's important to do is to sort out what can be done remotely and what can't. We're seeing people have more outstanding items to follow up. We're seeing the order of what parts of the business get audited change around a bit. But I do think it's important that people understand that it may be 6 months, 12 months before travel becomes something that's easier again. And so we are seeing just different ways to work around that. One more thing that I would mention, as Carlos said and as Philip said, there are new areas to focus on. There's the use of public funds. There are health issues that may need to be audited, so thinking about new areas of risk, and also sort of secondary areas of risk. I think there are a lot of, for example, in financial institutions, as banks may become hungry for new clients, that may be something where clients who might not have expected to make it through onboarding before sense that there may be a little bit more flexibility. People may not be having the same level of focus and scrutiny on new customers. And so there needs to be, I think, anticipation of how audit can react to what the business model will look like over the next 6 months or a year, and planning to take steps in that respect too.
Great, thank you. So look, we've always said that, when organizations are under stress, all sorts of things come out of the woodwork. And that certainly seems to be the case now. With respect to whistleblowers, for instance, the SEC in the United States announced the other day that it had received over 4,000 reports of tips, complaints, and referrals between mid-March and mid-May. So in 2 months, and that number was 35% higher than it had received the previous year, in the previous period, the same period in the previous year. And whether that's internal or in this case with the SEC external, it does seem that when you're not in the office, people might be more willing to be a whistleblower because they may feel there's less opportunity or for retaliation, or less likelihood of them being discovered to be a whistleblower. And of course, when you think about it, we have people who are being furloughed or laid off, and that doesn't necessarily leave them with warm and fuzzy feelings as to their former employee. And just as we talked about before, I mean, as companies are under stress, someone may be trying to cut corners, and there may be an actual other issues. I think also when we think about whistleblowers, certainly as when I was a prosecutor, we always understood that a whistleblower may very well be coming to us or coming to compliance because they have an agenda. They have some issues, but doesn't mean they're not telling the truth. And that's the key, that's a very hard thing to get through is, they may be out for a payoff, or they may be trying to settle a score, but they may actually have an issue to talk about. So with that sort of extended introduction, Katherine, how should companies be dealing with whistleblowers in today's environment?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And so the first thing I think that companies need to do is to expect more whistleblowing. As you say, when there's times of stress and disruption, that is when we start to hear from people more frequently, either because they are afraid of losing their jobs and think it will bring them some protection, or sometimes because there's a stress in the company. Someone is laid off, and the person who inherits those responsibilities may see that there is a problem with the way it was handled before. People have new responsibilities of all kinds that may lead them to blow the whistle on different people. You no longer have the same supervisor, and so now you blow the whistle on your former supervisor. So I think just being prepared to anticipate the uptick is an important thing, and make sure that as people are moving resources around, that you continue to have the resources available to handle whistleblower complaints. if any kind of structural changes are happening, that you're informing employees of how those may impact whistleblower complaints, if there's a change in how interviews will take place, if there's a change in how long one should expect to hear back in response to something that one raises, any changes like that to make sure that everybody is on the same page, I think is really important. And also just a heightened responsibility to report up the chain, to make sure that senior management is aware of what's coming out of the whistleblower complaints or the whistleblower hotline, I think becomes increasingly important in times of stress. So as you see more complaints with fewer resources, just prioritizing and thinking about how to manage those. There are also just the remote consequences. There's the ability to interview somebody in a sensitive situation when the person is not in the room with you, is something that we're all getting used to, and we'll talk about more today. And then lastly, I think, Philip, the point you mentioned about the government, the whistleblowers to the government, is just a really important thing to keep in mind. You have to always imagine that the same person who's speaking to you or someone else who has identified the same issue may be speaking to the SEC or DOJ or another government enforcement agency. And you want to have a good audit trail and to be able to demonstrate that you've taken the appropriate steps in response to that. I think another thing we're hearing from the government is, as it becomes more difficult to, to walk and talk, to knock on doors and interview employees themselves, people are more reliant on whistleblowers internally than before. That's who's able to give them the story of what's happening at the company in a way where people at the government may not have the same level of access to the company or to the corporation or financial institution that they had before. So I think those are some of the things that we're advising people to keep an eye on.
Right. So, Carlos, you have a whistleblower, you've done your triage, it's something that you need to address sooner than later. How do you do an investigation in today's world?
Okay, let me just add to the whistleblowing comments from Katherine. Government whistleblowing in Peru is relatively new. It's not as advanced as in the US or the DOJ. But on the months the months previous to the COVID crisis, the government antitrust agency officially launched its whistleblowing program. And we're talking about rewards, monetary rewards of up to about $150,000 for antitrust whistleblowers, which, as you mentioned, in this context where people are getting laid off and not everybody's leaving companies in the best of terms, is a very significant risk. And again, since this just happened right before COVID, I don't think companies are fully aware of the risk they're facing and the exposure to antitrust whistleblowers. And this is something we have to keep an eye on and be very careful moving forward. Now, back to the point of investigations. Investigations, there's their pros and their cons, right? Investigations are, of course, very challenging right now, and investigations are the cornerstone of any effective compliance system. Social distancing just presents practical difficulties. Teams have to be kept in place. I mean, you can't go without your investigation teams and your audit teams during the crisis. Existing investigations we've been engaged in one for several months, and it wasn't disrupted. Again, when it's data analysis, when it's traditional cloud-based document review platforms that we now use for data review, it's relatively simple to continue working, and we've been working on a couple of very large investigations. There is a financial strain to these investigations, and these systems are expensive. Fortunately, our clients are aware that they cannot abandon these investigations. They've pushed forward. So there's a lot we can do when we're working in these type of environments. Interviews and physical collections and so forth are limited. I mean, it's not the same thing to do a review. Sorry, battery issues. It's not the same thing to do an interview on a platform than face to face. I don't know, there's a sensitivity that's missing when you're not looking at someone in the eyes, I guess. But things can still be done. There might not be as effective, but that does not mean that we have to abandon them, right? We have to push forward. New investigations are a little more challenging. How do we preserve evidence? How we collect evidence when we really cannot leave our homes? IT investigations are a bit easier. I mean, as long as companies can access information and cloud-based backups and collect information, this can still be done. But again, it's challenging. We have to be a little creative, and we have to realize that we're not going to work at full capacity, but things can still be done, and they are getting done.
Okay. In terms of collections from, as you say, you're not in the office, they're not in the office. Have you, any particular tips on how we should collect data or collect documents?
This is a tough one. Forensic information collection oftentimes requires you to physically access machines. There are not that many people in Peru that actually do, say, world-class forensic collections. We normally have to fly them in from Colombia, from the States, from the UK. That's something that cannot be done right now. There are simply no commercial flights. You can't bring people in. There's some things you can do remotely, but you do not have the same tools to collect and recover information. When you're working remotely, you're basically just relying on your backups and eventually cloud-based backups. Physical backups are hard to access when you cannot move. Yes. Again, this is, I think, where investigations are hit hardest in Peru. I mean, other than things you can access remotely from your IT servers, which are not necessarily complete, it's very difficult as of now because of the lack of tools and movement and flights to bring in forensic specialists to get information. Personal devices, again, personal devices cannot be compiled, or the information cannot be lifted remotely. You actually need physical access to the device and special hardware, and that's something that right now it's very difficult to do. So securing these devices for future forensic work is key. We have to secure those devices now, not allow them to be manipulated, so that down the road, when things normalize a little bit and we can get those tools ready, we can proceed. And in the meantime, just use those means that are available to us during the quarantine.
And another challenge that we're seeing as things just change day to day is, especially in the cross-border context, but even within the United States, different regions are returning to normal a little bit faster than others. And so you may be in a position where a unit can access its own office and may be able to do its own hard copy collection, but you can't send in someone from headquarters or someone from a lawyer in another country to do it. And so then there's the added challenge of, do you want for the data collection to be done by the people whose data it is? Or is there more risk of spoliation if you go into that, and just documenting how that decision is made and why, and the risks of that is something that we're starting to explore as we see increasing differences among jurisdictions.
No, that was something I was going to mention as well, because even before the pandemic, if you had someone, preferably not a target of the investigation, who was in some place remote, for whatever reason. There was a possibility of sending them a collection kit, essentially, that our IT people say, it's a plug and play, stick this into the port, and it will image the hard drive, and then you send it back. And if you have a And if this is more of a person who might have relevant data, but is not actually someone you're concerned about spoliation, as Katherine mentioned, that this is something you may consider. It's not perfect, and there's obviously a chain of custody risk to it, but we've done it. We did it before pandemics, and it may be something we'd have to do. We have to do more often now. I've also been thinking about doorstep collections. You bring someone up, you have them bring their device and leave it on their doorstep, and then your person sits there and wipes it down with disinfectant and does what they need to do, and they hand it back. But you have to have resources in country, in city actually, to be able to do that. I mean, you're not going to, as Carlos says, you can't fly someone in to do a doorstep collection. And then hard copy is even worse. I mean, we did, again, before the pandemic, we had one matter in Kenya where all the project files were off-site in a warehouse with leaky roofs and in binders. There wasn't any electronic data. We would have a significant difficulty doing anything right now in that matter, simply because they were not digital. It wasn't a question of remote access. You'd have to physically go and open boxes and figure out what's there, the old-fashioned way. So, Katherine, we collect data, we review data, we do it wherever we can. What's next? How do you do an interview?
You do an interview virtually at the moment, and I've done a number of these, and I've actually had good experiences. I think there are challenges. I see the obvious difficulties at the top of the slide, but I found it very good, and I think there are some advantages to it that I think may cause us to do more of these even once we're less limited in our exposure to each other. One of the things that I think is really nice is you can schedule them much more easily. I've done a number of interviews in cross-border investigations where normally the lead time of having people fly in from a number of different places might take several weeks to interview, and we were able to, we had a captive audience on all sides. We had a witness who said, "Sure, I'm bored, I'll speak to you tomorrow," and we actually couldn't get ready fast enough. So we've had a very easy time scheduling these. We had a couple of instances where a document would come up a month later than when we'd spoken to someone, and he was available on our screens the next day to look at that document. We didn't need to reschedule anything. And the cost is so much lower to the clients that we were able to do more interviews. There were things where if someone were a secondary figure in the investigation and was not based in the same country as where we were primarily interviewing, we might have said, do we really want to send someone to Sweden to talk to that guy for half an hour? And now we're just speaking to him on the phone. So I think that's another nice thing. And in a way, if you have, as you sometimes do in these crazy scenarios, 8 lawyers speaking to one witness, in a way it's nice for the witness to be facing only one person on a screen and everybody else is either is on the sidebar or has their video shut off. It feels less like a conference room full of people that are all grilling you. And so I've actually seen some witnesses be more willing to speak up and more willing to speak than they might be otherwise. And finally, I have found sharing documents to be in a way better remotely as people are getting used to screen sharing. Sometimes you spend a lot of time saying, hey, across the table, can you turn to page 6? No, I'm looking at the paragraph 1 after that. Now we can just highlight on the screen and we all know that we're looking at exactly the same place. And it's actually made the interviews smoother in that respect. I wonder if there will be a scenario where at some point we're all back in the same conference room, but we're still using that kind of screen sharing so that everybody can look at the same sentence at the same time without all of the discussion of page and paragraph numbers. So those are the good points. There are, of course, some difficulties. One of them is the technical solutions. Everybody needs to be comfortable using a laptop, and people have their internet going out. We've had people who think that everything is working fine, and then a child needs to log on to a Zoom for school, and all of a sudden everybody's internet fizzles out. We've had people coming in and out. We've had dogs barking. And so just adapting to a less professional situation on all sides, I think, has been a challenge. Another thing that has been difficult is access to documents. We frequently want the witness to see the documents while he's sitting in the interview, but not to have a copy. And so to some extent, we can manage that through screen sharing, but we need to be very clear that you can't take pictures of this. You can't retain a copy for your records, and you don't always know what's happening. You don't know if there's another person videotaping the interview off screen. So you are accepting a little bit less control over the environment, and that is a challenge. And then the last challenge I would mention, and I haven't personally done this yet, but if you're interviewing a witness who has his own counsel, the ability of the witness and the counsel to speak to each other during the interview, or even just to communicate through just expressions and body language, that's challenging and that's different. And so in a few instances, we've had people say, we don't want our client to speak with you right now. We'd rather wait till we can all be in the same room. And at a certain point, we're going to have to accept that that may not work, and we're going to have to figure out ways for the attorney-client relationship in the interview context to continue even in this forum.
Thank you. So, Carlos, have you anything else to add on interviews, or should we move on?
No.
Okay.
I really haven't had the chance to conduct any during the quarantine.
Okay. So, so the next issue we wanted to talk about is, and I think this one goes to you again, Katherine, is the government closed?
They are not. They keep telling us they're not, and I think that they mean it. Again, as we were saying in a couple of other scenarios, there were a couple of weeks where the government said they weren't closed, but it was very hard to figure out what anybody could do remotely, and everybody seemed to be on pause a little bit, waiting until they could get back into the field. And then suddenly, at least in a number of things I'm working on, all the different agencies seem to go into overdrive at once. We were hearing anecdotally that there was specific guidance in certain DOJ offices, certain SEC enforcement offices, that people needed to get moving, that we needed to stay on the same pace. And since then, I've just seen just a very consistent level of intense investigation, but the way that the investigation is taking place is a little bit different. There's less ability, as we said earlier, to go out into the field and to go talk to people directly. And so I've seen a lot of government, of attorneys in various government agencies, just putting the pressure on my clients to say, what can you get me and how fast? We want this presentation earlier than we thought. We want you to cover more. In a sense, they're more reliant on the internal investigation and counsel presentation than they are on themselves right now. What they can get is what we can give them. And so that's keeping us very busy, but they seem busy too. One of the things that has been challenging again is because they want information, the documents are easy enough to give them when they're already collected and loaded. The presentations to the government, which is the key part of what we do, feels different. And so adjusting to that forum, the report is very different, just the back and forth and the relationships, particularly as I've started to work with some people that I haven't worked with before. You know, if there's a new agency, if suddenly the Fed gets involved and you have a new team at the Fed, it's different. It doesn't feel the same in the context of the video conference. And I think we're still adjusting to different ways that we can create that feeling of being in the same room with each other. One thing that I think has helped a lot is anticipating that the bench is just less hot in the initial meeting. And then, so we'll do a presentation. We get many fewer questions than we might have if we were all in the same room, seeing who wants to speak next and gesturing to each other about whose turn it is. But then I'll schedule another call a day or two after and say, hey, now that you've had time to reflect on what we shared, please let us know if you have any questions, any follow-up. And that meeting, that one-on-one or two-on-two conversation has taken on increased importance. That seems to be the environment that more replicates the feeling of being in the conference room.
Yeah. And Carlos, what's been your experience in Peru?
Yeah, the government is definitely not closed. You have different levels of government here. Health authorities, municipal governments, they've been active since day one. Labor authorities, they've been active, and that's been complicated because they've been kind of contradictory among themselves and supervising companies. But then the hardcore authorities, the ones that we're usually concerned with, they're active again. The General Controller's office has not stopped. I mean, I think the first or second weekend of the pandemic, they started announcing overvalued purchases by the government and investigating. There are several dozens of investigations being conducted right now by the General Controller's office into overvalued procurement processes. The Anti-Corruption District Attorney is active again, and this is not just Lavajato anymore. They're also looking into possible bribery and overvalued purchases by the government. The Antitrust Authority, which was dormant at first, issued a warning that antitrust laws were still in place. This was a month into the quarantine, and then just this week on Monday they issued their compliance guidelines. So we've actually had cases in which, I don't know, I guess the pandemic is also making interaction with certain government investigations much quicker. I mean, I've gotten phone calls and said, I need a call with your client tomorrow. And we've had web calls, you know, team calls. We've had pricing information and information requests, request of information being sent out and answered in 48 hours. I mean, we need information now to look into your pricing policies. Fortunately, we were ready for that, and we had the information out to the authorities, but they are active right now, and they are looking into, especially in those sensitive areas of the economy, you know, pharmaceutical, medical supplies, basic food stuff, sanitary products, everywhere where we didn't, until last night, we did not have a price gouging law in Peru. Congress passed one last night. We don't know if the executive will enact it or not, but there have been a lot of, there's been a lot of media attention on potential price gouging that consumer authorities and antitrust authorities, while not having direct powers to oversee this, have been conducting investigations. And unfortunately, government activity in Peru is largely driven by media. I mean, a big media scandal will trigger several investigations. And what we see in the last couple of weeks is that while their capacity to investigate is somewhat limited, they cannot physically go out right now and dawn raid you. They are requesting information. They are conducting video interviews, and I think that's going to continue and even get stricter as restrictions are lifted.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the dawn raids, because 2 weeks ago the GRU had said something. GRU in Brazil had said, our ability to initiate new investigations is somewhat limited because we're unable to conduct dawn raids. Yesterday, I was talking to a Brazilian lawyer, and they said, nope, they're doing dawn raids. They've started again. The UK and the SFO, they said the same thing. The SFO said, well, we're not doing search warrants. And I think agencies are getting, have differing levels of comfort with video interviews. They're getting more comfortable, but our government still won't use Zoom. In the UK, the SFO has at least as of the other week said we're not going to do any compelled interviews, what we would think of as grand jury interviews in the United States, but they'll do voluntary interviews by phone or video. They do have one actual physical limitation in that the interview rooms at the SFO's office in London are too small for social distancing. You can't have multiple people in the room and be 6 feet apart. So this has become an issue there. I want to talk just for a second or two, mindful of the time, as to whether there's a COVID-19 defense. And as you heard from both Carlos and me earlier, there's not. The laws have not changed, at least not changed in your favor. The anti-corruption, anti-fraud laws still apply, labor laws still apply, accounting fraud, securities fraud, procurement fraud, bank fraud, disclosures, false disclosures of your revenue management in pharmaceuticals, false claims with respect to efficacy of various treatments or equipment. And again, as we mentioned before, if you're dealing with the government in a way you haven't been before, possibly false claims. And Carlos mentioned the price gouging law that was just passed in Peru. we actually have had a law in the United States. I was a prosecutor for 13 years, and I never heard of this law. But it does outlaw price gouging and hoarding in times of crisis. And I never brought a price gouging case or a hoarding case in the whole time I was there. But my colleagues who are still in the government are now learning about this law and starting to bring these cases. So I think when you think about it, as I said, the government's not closed, but they are restricted, they are limited, and there may be less risk of an immediate enforcement, except for something very public or obvious, like a garage full of sanitizer or something like that. But this stuff has a tail to it, and in the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. There may not have been an immediate fraud prosecution brought in 2008 or 9, but there were afterwards, and they continue. They're still continuing. So, when and if we ever return to some degree of normalcy, I mean, there will be more investigations, and they will look back, and there's only so much understanding that you can expect from the government as to the special circumstances under which we were operating at the time in terms of what is permissible or not. As I said, there's not a COVID-19 defense, but the agencies have indicated, and I have the screen here is from the U.S. Department of Treasury, OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is the main regulator for sanctions compliance and sanctions violations. And they've essentially said, look, we understand you may have to prioritize certain and reallocate resources, and we'll recognize that. But in determining the appropriate response to an apparent violation, but not as a defense. And in Brazil, they said it won't affect the penalty. It'll just affect the time you get to pay the penalty. In the UK, you've had similar statements from the FSA. I think the closest I've ever seen to anything that seems to be a defense is the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK has encouraged its prosecutors to accept guilty pleas to fewer or lesser offenses in order to expedite the docket and prevent a clogging up of the docket. So, Carlos, a closing comment?
I want to touch on something you mentioned. Thank you. When you go back and you look at the large, for example, antitrust price fixing investigations that have been conducted in Peru in 2014, 15, 16, that resulted in these multi-million-dollar fines, they all have in common that critical price fixing occurred between 2008 and 2010. And that's not a coincidence. That's because times of financial crisis lead to desperate actions. And this is the time where we need to reinforce again our compliance systems. We're talking about, there is a lag, obviously, between the time you do breach your compliance obligations, commit infractions, and the government finally can process you. So we're looking at a 4 or 5 year lag in Peru in these antitrust investigations that I mentioned. But that lag is getting smaller and smaller. Authorities have much more powers now. They have leniency programs in place. They have whistleblower programs in place. So, and they're much more savvy and sophisticated, and they know what's going on. So I would expect, again, you said that the laws have not changed. No, they haven't changed, and there is no COVID-19 defense. I would say that they're even getting stricter because authorities are aware that and in these times, the incentive to go out of bounds are greater, and they've learned from the past, and they're going to be much more vigilant. They are being much more vigilant right now, and will be as restrictions are relaxed. So it's very important again to reinforce our compliance systems, reinforce the values of the corporation, keep our communication channels open, and be as flexible as possible in these times.
Thank you. Katherine?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, which is that I think over the last few months, we have probably all felt personally and certainly seen professionally, that certain people have a tendency to say, this is a time of crisis, I can't function the way I usually do. And that's very understandable. And I think everybody is being patient with each other. It's been really nice to see the enforcement agencies, everyone's approaching each other as human beings in a way that feels a little bit different from before. But it's really not a defense. And when we look back, I think, we see a little bit of that post-financial crisis. If we look way back, we see it a little bit in the New York area post-September 11th, a tendency to say, well, you can't really hold the steps that people took against them if they took them during this time period that was such a difficult time. And so I just think an important message is this is a really difficult time, and everyone is continuing to be as patient and understanding as possible. But the building blocks for the next step, it's important to keep them in place. And 2 years from now, we're not going to be able to look back at the summer of 2020 and say that was a time when we didn't send out hold notices. That was a time where we didn't take notes of witness interviews. And so all of those loose threads, we need to remind each other and be vigilant of that. We need to continue to do our jobs properly, create new patterns where the old ones don't work anymore, and be able to look back at this time and say that we all still behaved as professionally as we would have otherwise.
Great. So I want to close by thanking Katherine and Carlos for an excellent presentation, and thanking all of our participants who have stuck with us throughout this hour. Thank you, and everyone stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Keep safe.